home. Don't want to spoil too much. Yes, hopefully everyone can see my screen all right. Hopefully I'm going to thumbs up. Yeah, we're assuming we're good. What's up, everybody? My name is Zachary Poston. I'm a graduate student at Texas State University. I'm excited to be presenting this with Dr. Jonathan Surovell, a professor at the same university, over the topic Towards a More Rational Society, Scaling Argument Mapping in Higher Education. This is going to be interesting. This is going to be fun, so just hang around for it. And we're going to start with a problem that we see, the problem that we find. Is that most educators consider critical thinking to be of primary importance in their students' education. All right, but however, despite this, we don't see critical thinking to abound. And so what we want to talk about in this paper is we're going to argue first that the widespread adoption of argument mapping will solve the problem of meager gains in students' critical thinking outcomes in post-secondary education. Second, that to get argument mapping widely adopted, that it needs to be brought up to federal accessibility standards. Third, we'll discuss how we've taken steps towards achieving these goals with the argumentation application. And lastly, we'll explore how adopting argument mapping in higher education might contribute to a more rational society. So following all these, if you take a look to the right, you can see on this graph, I mentioned how critical thinking gains are somewhat meager. And if you notice this, you can see 0.3 and 0.38 for first semester of college in a semester of college with philosophy and a critical thinking course. Because of this, we can notice that 0.3 is we could say a small effect size is a general statistician's rule of thumb right here. And 0.38 is close to a moderate. 0.38 is a moderate statistical notice. And so though there is an increase, though there's a gain, though something was learned here, it might be slower than we'd anticipate, especially given how much we invest and expend into higher education and how much we expect out of higher education as well. So we might ask, if we go from up to 0.3, 0.38, is there any way that we could maybe do more? And we propose, yes, we propose argument mapping as a solution for these meager gains, and argument mapping to improve this and get significant and substantial gains. And so as you can see here, there's a diagrammatic thing in front of you, which displays an argument. And at the top, that blue box, you should learn argument mapping. And all these here represent an argument. And if you want, we dropped in chat a link to the application. The first link will show you this. And what you notice is you can kind of drag around on it. You can click a few buttons and change a few things. You can edit the text. And that's kind of how the program works. It's an interesting way to see an argument and go through it. And so what you can see here is that this argument demonstrates itself through claims between boxes, with the main contention at top, reasons for and against underneath. And it's not just simple as, oh, well, here's a reason for, but you can also have co-premises, which work together to support a higher contingent, such as you should learn argument mapping, or that these two go to support these two. So the greatest strength lies in its visual, but really there's a seeming tactile thing that's going on here, which is interesting. And everything that relates, it shows that it coheres. And so it's important to note that you might see, well, this is just kind of a diagram. It just shows this cool thing. How do we know it really works? Well, let's just go to the data then. Solution argument mapping, we argue that the widespread adoption of argument mapping can address critical thinking concerns, particularly those of meager gains in higher education. And so if you look, we have the same graph, but we added an extra row. And you might think, what's with that extra row? Well, let's take a look at it. A semester of college with an argument mapping course. So not just with a philosophy and critical thinking course. And you notice that the gains aren't just okay, they aren't just meager, but instead they're big. It's above points, it's 0.7 and above, which is that's a big gain to have. And so we noticed that. And it's also a colon. If you notice that, that's from a colon source, which is a controlled trial, which is really cool thing for us to know. And so we can see that there's statistical evidence that goes to show that argument mapping is good and useful and beneficial. But more than this, there's other benefits beyond just critical thinking per se. We notice that a lot of traits get amplified if we use argument mapping to try to address them. So more deliberate and fair-minded approaches to understanding arise in this. We can know that, especially in contentious issues and interpersonal challenges. If I can read a quote from it, says, findings reveal that students face cognitive interpersonal challenges in critically thinking about and constructing argument maps for controversial topics, but that their efforts led them to take a more deliberate and fair-minded approach in examining them. And an interesting part of this study also showed that argument mapping skills don't just stay in the classroom or in academia, rather go to the, I guess, real world, if we want to call it that, but they go beyond just the classroom setting. They go beyond, and this toleration and fair-mindedness that's brought in deliberate kind of thinking about things goes beyond just goal-oriented process standard testing sort of things. We can also see better writing skills, again, a controlled trial. We can see that with computer-assisted argument mapping, it may respondents more, quote, aware of their self-regulation of learning as they manifested inclination on their planning, self-monitoring, self-evaluation, reflection, effort, and self-efficacy. So we can see here that writing's also improved, but so are many other things, such as scientific reasoning, which among a lot of jargonistic terminology thrown in this paper, there are a few ones such as that are a little bit more forthcoming and understandable and comprehensible, such as you can identify new types of gaps of arguments in the literature regarding content things, which is really cool. So instead of just looking at arguments saying, oh, wow, this is what I have to debate in my mind, you can say, there's something missing here, and there's some fundamental key that I could be getting by just seeing in argument mapping. Not just seeing an argument map, but argument mapping and seeing that. You can offer a structural and progressive view of a theory development in a particular domain that could be used to link and compare insights from competing theoretical lenses. So we were just talking about identifying new gaps within the literature, right? But now we're talking about above the literature. We're doing kind of like systemic analysis of it, which is interesting. And then finally, we can pose a closer linkage between theory testing and theory building by focusing the testing on arguable aspects of the theoretical claim. So again, argument mapping makes us more, it indicates more of what we should be paying attention to in an argument, the facets that are most interesting. And finally, we have mathematical reasoning, which sounds a little different than just mathematical skills, but ultimately it's the logical cognitive connection between mathematical statements, which might be just as ephemeral and confusing, and then of course, better recall of course content. We can see a significant, quote, significant effect on recall, retention, and comprehension. And now, thank you for these, and I'm going to hand it off to the next question, a big question. If argument mapping is so effective, why isn't it taught more? I'm going to hand it off to Dr. Jonathan Surovell to answer that and a few more.
Thank you, Zach. Let me actually start out here with one more benefit of argument mapping that we forgot to put in our slide, but it's especially relevant. I forgot to put it in the slide, but it's especially relevant to this conference. There was a study of argument mapping in a master's education course, and they found positive results as well. They found it was more effective for learning theories of learning and teaching. So there you go, one more of the many benefits. So now let me go on to what Zach brought up. Why isn't argument mapping more widely used if it's so effective? I mean, many of you have probably never heard of it. Well, there might be a few reasons. There are some interesting theories, by the way, about why argument mapping is so effective, why having this visual component of learning about critical thinking is so effective. We don't have time to go through all that, I don't think. But it has been shown to be very effective. But so why isn't it used more often? Here's one reason why, I think. Currently, there's no way to teach argument mapping in conformance with university accessibility standards like Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act in the US. So Section 508 requires that federal institutions or institutions that work with the federal government be accessible to people of all abilities and all disabilities. In particular, universities have to make their courses accessible to the blind. Now, a blind person cannot draw an argument map with pencil and paper, and the argument mapping apps, the computer-based apps that have existed so far aren't accessible to blind people. So if an instructor wanted to teach argument mapping, they would have to either find a way to make it, they would have to find an accommodation for a blind student, and I don't see how that's feasible, having taught argument mapping myself. It's very hard to kind of run a parallel course with a whole different topic. They have to do that, or they have to risk violating the law, worst case scenario, litigation. And so some teachers are going to be worried about using it, and educational institutions can't get behind it and put resources into it. And so that's something we're trying to fix. So we've been building an app called Argumentation. That'll be the first fully accessible argument mapping app. A blind person can use it either through a mouse, or they can use it with key commands and a screen reader. And so a blind user can use it in the latter way. We're optimistic that it's going to be accessible because we built it using inclusive design principles. For example, no decision about us without us. We've consulted with blind people in order to determine how to make the app accessible to them and user-friendly to them. We've done a lot of training on accessibility and accessible tech. And lastly, we've got a comprehensive accessibility audit going on right now. Fingers crossed for that. And so we're hoping to launch, sort of full launch of the product soon. Another thing that'll be needed is an accessible textbook. The app enabling students to create and edit and view maps is one thing that's necessary for making argument mapping accessible. But for the whole course, for an argument mapping course to be accessible, all the learning materials need to be accessible. And that means we can't rely on textbooks that just have images of example maps or just images of solutions. And so what we'll do is integrate the book with the app so that readers can follow links to see the solutions to practice problems or to see examples if they're blind and they can't just view the image. What about our title, Towards a More Rational Society? This argument is a hypothesis, okay? A lot of the reasons I'm relying on here at the lower level of the argument map, a lot of the claims in these reasons are not highly confirmed, but there's some reason to accept them, and I'll go through that a little bit. And by the way, you can access this map in the Argumentation app if you'd like by clicking on the link in the chat, the second link. Okay, so claim, contention, teaching argument mapping at scale, right? If we can open the floodgates to widespread use of argumentation, if this can become, let's say, a standard part of a college education, as its efficacy suggests it should be, then we would make society more rational. I'm using that term loosely, happy to elaborate if there's interest in that. But so why think that? Well, a society's general level of education may make it more democratic. There is evidence, there's at least a strong association between how educated a society is and how democratic it is. That's some reason, I think, to think that if we significantly improve the efficacy of education, of at least parts of education, that will have a tangible effect on how democratic the society is. Co-premise working with that claim is something along the lines of what I just said. Argument mapping doubles, or even more than doubles, a college education's efficacy at improving critical thinking skills. Next argument, better critical thinking skills cause more democratic attitudes. Again, that's a hypothesis. The study I cite shows an association between those two things, an association between critical thinking skills and democratic attitudes. Next argument, better critical thinking skills reduce belief in conspiracy theories. Again, a study showing an association. And lastly, better critical thinking skills improve decision-making in general, whether it be decisions about finances, interpersonal relationships, health, driving your car, not getting into accidents, anything, life outcomes. Again, a study finding an association. So a bunch of hypotheses. That brings me to my last point, which is that, okay, we've got all these interesting hypotheses here about critical thinking. If we can get more investment in argument mapping, if it becomes more widely used, there are probably some interesting studies that we could use it for. If we use argument mapping on our test subjects, we can get a big increase in critical thinking over a short period of time. And that would give us a way of looking at whether we also get increases in other things that critical thinking might plausibly cause, like the things I listed here. Democratic attitudes, belief in conspiracy theory, and decision-making, aka life outcomes. Thank you very much.